Thank you so much, Sachi, and thank you so much to the CILA and COI teams, and of course the ABA. I'm really excited to be here with everybody today. This was a really unique group of folks to get together, and it was great to hear a little bit of the tail end of the prior presentation and just be able to be in community with others who are doing this work from this particular lens. And I'm hopeful that we can have a rich discussion today about how we can incorporate a lot of the deep knowledge we have, and that was made clear by some of the discussion at the end of the last presentation about the importance of trauma-informed work and how we can incorporate that into the programming and the structures and the policies that we have in our pro bono programming as well. So really quickly about myself, that is the least important thing today. So I'll run through this as fast as possible. I've been practicing law for just under a decade, which is a little wild every time that I say that, although the positive side of that is I'm almost at loan forgiveness, so yay. In addition to immigration, I also have a background in family law and child welfare, as well as victims' rights. But I've been focusing pretty much primarily on humanitarian forms of immigration relief since 2017. And what a time to get into immigration that was. In addition to my direct representation work, I've also been a very dedicated student and eventually trainer of trauma-informed practices. So I have been training attorneys and other legal professionals across the country on trauma-informed lawyering for probably the past 5 or 6 years. And it's become an integral part of how I approach my work with my clients. It's how I approach my care for myself. And now that I'm in a supervising role for our next generation of attorneys, that's also a really big part of how I approach my role as a mentor and a guide for them as they get into this work. I identify as a trauma survivor myself. And so honestly, a lot of the things that I've learned in my professional life have bled over and been very helpful in my personal life and vice versa. And I have a very strong feeling, given what I know about the prevalence of trauma, that I'm likely not the only person who identifies that way on this call. And then on a personal level, because I think that's always important to remember to include beyond our, many professional accolades, we are people outside of being attorneys and people first. So when I am not lawyering and trauma informing, I am an avid runner. My poison of choice is marathons, but I'm taking a bit of a break and focusing on some shorter stuff right now, which has been delightful. I'm based in New York City, so I've got Central Park as my backyard, which is gorgeous, but oh my God, the hills kill me. I am also a mom to 3 fur babies, one of whom is of the canine variety and rather vocal. So if you hear him barking in the background at any point, apologies in advance. I'll try to mute myself because for 20 pounds, he's got quite a voice. And then a couple quick housekeeping things just before we jump in. First of all, my work with pro bono attorneys has been primarily in the context of direct representation. So I know, some folks in the last presentation were talking about a lot of other models, including clinics and consultations, all of which are great and super important. I just wanted to give some framework for my experiences and sort of the lens that I'll be talking about this through. I think that a lot of the things that I plan to discuss today, will be relevant and transferable to lots of different scenarios that you might be working with pro bonos, but I was writing a lot of this with the intent of a direct representation in mind. And then as far as questions go, I'm going to do my best timing wise to leave us some time at the end for questions, especially since it seems like this is a really, really lively group. I love that so much, especially later in the day. But that being said, I'm usually pretty good about keeping an eye on questions on the Q&A box or the chat. So please do feel free to pop those in as we're going along. I know sometimes it's easier to write it when it comes to mind. And by the time of you get to the end of the presentation, it's hard to remember what the question was about. At least that's me when I attend webinars. And also you're welcome to jump off mute too. I know this is a little bit of a larger group, and personally, I probably would be scared to do that, but genuinely, please interrupt me at any point. I would much rather hear a question and have somebody have a chance to share their thoughts and miss that. And then the last piece that I wanted to flag is we're going to be using a platform called Mentimeter today for just a couple of group questions. For anybody who's used Mentimeter before, it's really great. I was introduced to it earlier this year by some colleagues, and man, I've been addicted to it for any webinars. It's a interactive, live polling, way for us to share responses in real time with one another. It's completely anonymous unless you choose to identify yourself on any of the responses. And I will have all this information up on the screen when we get to those questions, but just as like an FYI, it will require you navigating to menti, menti.com, and we'll have that on the slides and also pop that in the chat, and then type in a code, and that'll bring you to our live questions that we'll move through, and you'll be able to see the results both on your device and then on the screen as we move through those. I just wanted to flag that if anybody wants to pull their phone up or open up a second window on their computer to just have that at the ready, but we'll also leave time for folks to do that when we get to those points. All right, so without further ado, we can jump on in, and I thought we would start by thinking about what our objectives are for our session today. And I would say the first one is to define trauma and forms of work-related stress. I am sure that many of us on this call are very familiar with this, both from, just an educational point of view, but also a personal experience perspective. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. This isn't intended to be a training on trauma and its effects, but I do think it's helpful to do a quick run through of some key concepts to make sure that we have a shared understanding and a shared language around that. So we'll be looking at the definition of trauma, sources that it can stem from, its prevalence, and breaking down. I'm using work-related stress as kind of a catch-all term to encompass a lot of different things, which we'll talk about, from burnout to secondary traumatic stress to vicarious trauma. So we'll touch, briefly on the spectrum of work-related stress and some of the differences between how those things show up. The second objective, I'd say, is for us to have an understanding of what some of the challenges that our pro bono attorneys often face, particularly the non-legal challenges, right? Like my job as a pro bono supervising attorney is often to be the substantive TA on a case. And obviously that's very, very important. But honestly, I think even as part of my preparation for this, I really had some light bulb moments in talking with pro bono attorneys that I work with about some of the other needs that often get overlooked. And I include myself in that as, being one who has overlooked them in the past. So thinking about particularly folks who come into pro bono work with little to no experience with direct representation or exposure to working with trauma survivors, and often are operating in vacuums, whether they are at firms, despite the fact that there are lots of folks there. It sounds, from the feedback I've received, it sounds like there's not always a lot of built-in support there. And on the other end of the spectrum, working with solos or retirees or parents coming back into the workforce who don't have any colleagues at all. And we'll talk about how both of those things are some of the factors that can contribute to the likelihood that somebody would develop work-related stress. And then last but not least, I would love to think about how we can apply the existing frameworks that we have available to us for trauma-informed lawyering and also trauma-informed organization. So SAMHSA, I'm sure folks are familiar, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has put out some really great materials over the past decade or so on principles and ways to implement from an organizational and policy level trauma-informed practices within an organization and within a program. And although they are framed out for thinking about a program with your direct employees being the ones to benefit from those policies, I think that they can be equally as applied as equally to pro bono programs. So I want to think about what that might look like and share some ideas that we might have as we move through the discussion. And also I would love to hear what folks are already doing as well. So by the end of this hour, we'll hope to have a clear understanding of these three objectives and feel more empowered to enhance our pro bono programs to not only better support the clients that we're serving, but just as importantly, the pro bono attorneys who are actually doing the work. So that being said, let's get started with that first objective, defining trauma and forms of work-related stress. So there's lots of definitions of trauma out there, but the one that I use comes from SAMHSA. So again, that's Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which defines trauma as an event, a series of event, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and may have lasting adverse effects on that individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So the two things I always highlight from that definition: one, trauma is entirely subjective, right? It's about how that event or circumstance is experienced by that individual, which means we can have the same set of facts, two different people go through them. And for one, that's a traumatic event. And for one, it isn't. And there's a lot of different reasons why that might be the case, but we want to make sure we're never assuming that something is or isn't traumatic, and always defer to the lived experience of the person who's been through it. And then the second piece of that that is important is thinking about the wide-reaching effects of trauma, right? So mental, physical, social, emotional, spiritual. I can't think of any other parts of one's identity that's not, that are not listed there. And obviously that's something that we keep in mind when we're working with clients, because we understand that this thing that we are hearing about in the context of their legal case is not only impacting them in that small sphere that we are working with them in, is, their immigration status, but in all these other areas of their lives. And I would say the same goes for when we think about how trauma impacts pro bono attorneys. We don't just want to be thinking about how are you feeling in this 1 hour client meeting or immediately after, or how are you feeling in this hearing or this prep for this hearing, but what's going on after? How is this showing up outside of your pro bono hours? How is this showing up in your regular job, in your relationships? So I think those are the two big takeaways for me when I think about this definition and what we want to be focusing on. And as I'm sure everybody knows, there's a lot of different places that trauma can stem from. This is very much a non-exhaustive list, but to just give some sort of sense of the variety of places that somebody might experience a traumatic event throughout their lives. And given how exhaustive this is, or how long this is, it's not surprising that 90% of adults in the United States report that they've experienced at least one, if not more, traumatic event at some point in their lives. So again, thinking about this for clients, we always want to be entering into a space with a client from perhaps the perspective that there's a likelihood of trauma. And again, we want to defer to the client to tell us whether that is or isn't the case. But it's a safe assumption to make, given what we know, given what the numbers tell us about how prevalent traumatic experiences are. But again, the same goes for pro bono attorneys. And I'm sure that there's probably research out there that backs this up, but I can say anecdotally, and I have a feeling folks would probably share this experience. I find that a lot of people who end up in trauma work have experienced trauma themselves. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think in a lot of ways, that's an incredible superpower that we can have as advocates, because we can relate on that very genuine and deep, deep level. The flip side of that is that it can make us more susceptible to be impacted by the exposure to our clients' trauma. And we want to make sure we're thinking about that with our pro bono attorneys, right? Who are the folks that are raising their hands at firms to take these cases? Who are the people that are drawn to this type of work? And what might exist in their experiences and in their backgrounds that led them to that and makes them, wonderful advocates, but also is something to be aware of to make sure that they're able to take care of themselves and we're able to support them effectively in doing so. So I mentioned before, when I'm talking about work-related stress, that's just sort of a catch-all to try to capture the variety of different ways that this can show up for people. And this is not to say that these happen in vacuums on their own. You experience moral injury and then you move to professional burnout. These can all overlap with one another. You can go back and forth on this spectrum. I did try to organize things in, and obviously this is very subjective because this depends on how somebody experiences something, but I did try to organize this on a bit of a spectrum to show from increasing severity, right? So thinking about the things that would be needed to help get somebody back to more of like an equilibrium after a moral injury is probably going to be a little bit less than if we're all the way on the other side of that scale and talking about vicarious trauma. That's where, as you all know, we see people leave the profession altogether, and you need much more dramatic interventions to combat the effects of that vicarious trauma versus moral injury or professional burnout. So just to differentiate quickly between these, and by all means, I don't mean to say that these are end-all be-all definitions. I actually learned about moral injury last year from a colleague. I'd never even heard of it before, but when she described it, I was like, wow, that is its own separate thing. That's completely right. But I think it's important to understand that these are different things. I think often we see burnout used as sort of like this catch-all, and that everything is burnout, and it's not. Burnout is a distinct thing from secondary traumatic stress, and the way that we respond to burnout versus secondary traumatic stress needs to be different as well. So moral injury, the way that I like to think about that is when something that you have to do at work is misaligned with your internal moral values. So I know one I struggle with is my moral value is that I want to be able to help everybody and take every case. I know that the reality is that I can't. And, at this point in my career, I've come to terms with that and am more at peace with that. But I think looking back, that's definitely something that I struggled with when I got into this work, because it was devastating to me to have to say no to somebody that I can't take their case because I just didn't have the capacity to do that. Burnout is obviously that exhaustion from prolonged stress at work. But the thing I want to highlight there is that it's not unique to trauma work. So anybody can suffer from professional burnout, even people who have no, direct interaction with clients or the people they serve and have no interaction with trauma survivors. Not to minimize it in any way, just distinguishing that this is not something that's unique to work with trauma survivors. Empathy fatigue, kind of moving along this spectrum, is where the well is dry, is kind of how I think of it, where you just feel like you have nothing left to give. It can be that sort of like numb feeling after just hearing so many heartbreaking things again and again and again. And you feel like you lose some of that ability to feel or care or relate to. Then secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, I think, are where we really start to see people experience symptoms that really mirror PTSD and things that we would see in somebody who was a direct survivor of the trauma, right? So with that secondary traumatic stress, you can see people having nightmares, interrupted sleep, decreased appetite, anxiety, depression. And that secondary traumatic stress can come from just one exposure to trauma. In contrast, vicarious trauma is usually something that we see happen over an extended period of exposure to trauma again and again and again. And this is where we start to see an actual shift in worldview because of that constant exposure to trauma. So the example that I give is I used to work at ACS, which anybody familiar with New York, that's the child welfare agency. Not my proudest moment, but it is what it is. Gave me some good context now that I'm in this line of work. But I remember very specifically that I had two coworkers who were parents, and once you were more experienced, you would start taking on abuse cases and eventually sex abuse cases. And even though they were supervisors who had been there for the better part of a decade, they could not take the sex abuse cases once they became parents. They were like, I just can't. It was too close to home. And they, I remember a conversation with one of them, how she shared that when she first became a parent and she was still handling those types of cases, she would just take it home with her. And all she could look at when she dropped her child off at daycare or she was at a family event was just thinking about all of these other cases that she had been exposed to where these adults in these children's lives completely violated the trust. So that's that vicarious trauma where we see how you view the world start to change because of the things that you've been exposed to in your work. So anybody who's working in a high stress job, and certainly anybody who's working with trauma survivors, can be at risk of developing any of those forms of work-related stress that we talked about. But there are certain things that might make somebody a little bit more susceptible. And the way I like to think of this is not, a death sentence, that if somebody identifies with something on this screen, that they will automatically develop vicarious trauma and never be able to do this work. Instead, I like to think of it as, just like health information, right? If I have a genetic predisposition to diabetes or something in my family, that doesn't mean that I'm going to develop that, but it's important for me to be aware of. It might inform my diet, it might inform my lifestyle choices, and it'll, ideally make sure that I take steps to decrease that possibility as much as I can. So just to highlight these, because I think a lot of them apply to our pro bono attorneys. I talked already about prior trauma, the prevalence of folks who come into this work because they themselves have been through a traumatic experience. And that means that there's more of a likelihood that being exposed to others' trauma might trigger an emotional response. And that's probably going to need additional coping mechanisms and support. Another one is working in isolation. So I started to touch on this earlier, right? So whether we're talking physical or emotional isolation, that can really intensify feelings of stress and the effects of secondary trauma. So in some cases, pro bono attorneys might work in relative isolation with limited interaction with colleagues. Again, whether they're at a big firm that just doesn't have a lot of community or support built into it, or they're solos who have nobody else in the office or in the home with them. And that lack of regular communication and lack of support from peers and other people in it with you can really increase that risk of feeling overwhelmed and leading to that work-related stress manifesting. The third is a tendency to withdraw. So people who are just naturally a little bit more introverted or tend to cope with stress by going inward and internalizing their emotions, that can exacerbate it, right? I always think of it like it's kind of toxic sometimes to keep all of that in. You have to get it out and purge it somehow. And that's why I know that in my work and when I'm supervising and mentoring folks, making sure that we find time to just debrief and just talk about the things that we get exposed to and the things that we hear are so important. Prolonged exposure to client trauma. Obviously, we just talked about this with vicarious trauma. The more exposure that you have, the more likely that that's going to just build and build and build over time. Lack of experience, and that can be both substantive experience, right? So people who are new to asylum law, new to immigration law, but also lack of experience working with trauma survivors, lack of experience working with direct representation at all, as is often the case for many pro bono attorneys. They've never represented a single human in the course of their career. And that's a very different thing. It's, just like I wouldn't know what I was doing if I had to represent a corporation. It's just as jarring to suddenly be responsible for this human who is sitting right in front of you. And then last is the lack of support. And this was something that when I talked with pro bono attorneys I worked with in prep for today, that really I heard a lot of, and we'll talk more about what that looks like for them. But, not having access to a robust support system, both in and outside of work, can really impact somebody's ability to cope with work-related stress and bounce back and have resiliency in those moments. So with those considerations in mind, let's explore a little bit about what it means to be trauma informed and what strategies we might be able to use to support attorneys effectively in our pro bono initiatives. And we're going to be using 3 different frameworks that were put forward by SAMHSA that I mentioned already: Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The first of which is the 4 R's, and I would just flag that all 3 of these, if you think about that for a second, are discussed in the practical guide that's linked at the bottom of this slide. And that guide is also included as part of the written materials that are located on the CILA website. So if folks want to dive into that more, it's a really, really fantastic resource. So the 4 R's are principles that were developed in 2014 and have been really instrumental in shaping how we as service providers understand and address trauma from an organizational level. So the first R is realize. And the idea is that a trauma-informed program, organization, or system acknowledges the widespread impact of trauma and understands that trauma isn't isolated to just a few individuals, but is actually a pervasive public health issue. And this is crucial because it sets the foundation for a trauma-informed approach. We have to recognize that trauma is prevalent and it affects all of these aspects of an individual's life, like we talked about when we looked at the definition of trauma. And that includes people who are in helping professions and impacted by exposure to their clients' trauma. The second R is recognize. So a trauma-informed program is adept at recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. And this is one of my favorite parts, not just in clients, but families, staff, and anybody connected to the program. So that's having this keen awareness that trauma can manifest in a lot of different behaviors and reactions and emotions, and that it doesn't just affect one person. So if one person is struggling with a traumatic response, that's going to touch all the other relationships in their lives. And that's why, thinking again about not just how a pro bono attorney is impacted by the trauma in the course of their work, but what that looks like when they put that work down. What does it look like when they're at home with their families and with the other relationships in their lives? The third R is respond. So a trauma-informed program is going to go beyond just awareness that the trauma exists. It's going to actively integrate knowledge about trauma into its policies, procedures, and practices. And this response is comprehensive and really involves making trauma sensitivity an integral part of how a program operates. So adapting approaches to accommodate the needs of people who have experienced trauma. For example, if we're working with a pro bono attorney who is struggling with one of the forms of work-related stress, we want to make sure that we're responding accordingly with empathy and emotional support and providing resources for that individual to be able to take care of themselves appropriately, just the way that we would if one of our staff members were in a similar position. Another thought is, if we know a client suffers from trauma responses, maybe that's part of the information we share up front in our placement package, in addition to the substance of the case, that this client has identified X, Y, and Z traumatic experiences. They've shared that they struggle with A, B, and C responses as a result. And that can inform a pro bono attorney, both, maybe that particular trauma is triggering for them personally, and so that's not a case that they feel comfortable taking. But also giving them a heads up for how trauma manifests for that particular client so that they can be more well-equipped and aware of how to respond in those moments from a trauma-informed stance. And then the last R is to resist, the idea being resist re-traumatization. And this principle emphasizes that commitment to actively prevent further trauma for the client and also for the frontline staff, including pro bono attorneys. So creating an environment that minimizes that re-traumatization through creating safe spaces, reducing triggers, and ensuring that our actions and decisions don't inadvertently harm individuals who've already experienced trauma. And so that obviously means teaching pro bono attorneys to recognize, to have strategies to minimize re-traumatization for their own clients. But of course, it also means taking steps to reduce re-traumatization for pro bono attorneys. So thinking about like placement resources, maybe there's trigger warnings, right, at the top of a placement package, like sexual assault or interpersonal violence or LGBTQ violence, so that the pro bono attorney doesn't have to get to the thick of the persecution story to realize, oh, this is not safe for me to be reading emotionally. Just ideas. So the next framework from SAMHSA are the principles of a trauma-informed approach. And I'm sure these are the ones that folks are probably most familiar with. These are the ones that we look at when we're thinking of our own direct representation and our own direct service to clients. So these are the 6 guiding principles that provide a framework for what it means to deliver trauma-informed services in any area, not just limited to legal services. So I want to just touch on each of these quickly and think about what they might look like in the context of a pro bono program, because I think that we're all pretty familiar with what they would look like in our direct representation work. So safety, obviously we're thinking of physical and emotional safety, but we can support this one by maybe offering safe and confidential spaces for consultations. I know that was one of the things that was touched upon a little bit at the end of the last presentation. Ensuring security of client information. So thinking of how we're sharing information back and forth, especially after the placement, if there's documents being sent to and from the pro bono attorney and a mentor for review, thinking of how we are sharing that information and if there's systems that we can be using and bringing our pro bono attorneys onto to increase the security of that information for clients. And then, of course, providing trauma-informed trainings to our attorneys as well. Trustworthiness and transparency, this could look like fostering trust with our pro bono attorneys by promoting ethical conduct and giving them the resources to understand the ethical issues that show up in immigration cases, of which they probably don't have a lot of exposure to. Clear communication with attorneys and clients. I know one of the things that people were talking about at the last presentation was what to do when a client reaches out and says, hey, I haven't heard from my pro bono attorney in months, what's going on? So ideally, we would want to have that transparency up front so that everybody understands their role. The client understands that we as the placing agency are not their attorney, depending on how our models are set up. We're maybe just part of the legal team in some way, but we're not their attorney, that this is, the pro bono is the person that they're going to have that relationship with. And making sure that there's an understanding among everybody about what's expected in terms of communication and how we would approach things if a client reaches out to us or turns to us for a question that's more appropriate to be asked of their actual legal counsel. And transparent program policies as well. I think one of the things I hear the most from pro bono attorneys is like, I just don't know what to expect, both substantively, like if I'm taking on an asylum case, that sounds really big, and what does that look like? But also, what is expected of me? For us, we're so used to, on the nonprofit side of things, like reporting, right? And I know that a lot of private attorneys have their own version of that with like billable hours, but oftentimes I forget what a pain in the butt it is to constantly have to be reporting back to somebody. I did this, court appearance, I drafted this document, I filed this thing, and copies of all of that, maintaining your own records, but then basically sending a second version of that to the organization who's mentoring you as a pro bono work. So really having transparency up front and making sure that people understand what's expected on both sides and they know what they're getting into, that can really avoid frustration down the road. Peer support is a really big one. And I think we'll talk more about this later on when I share some of the feedback from pro bono attorneys that I got, but thinking about mentorship programs, not just a one-on-one mentor, but if there's other resources that can be made available, other people that can be made available. I think resources written, recorded are one thing, but having a human and a relationship that you can connect with, I think is really, really important for that peer support to just share experiences and strategies and talk through things. Collaboration and mutuality from a pro bono standpoint, I think this can look like being actively involved with our pro bonos to get their feedback regularly about how things are working, what their experience has been like. They're the ones who are, if you think of it kind of like a product, right? Our product is our pro bono model that we are pitching to them. So they're the ones who have the user experience. They can tell us what works and what doesn't. And I think that's a really important source that we want to have an ongoing dialogue with them about. Empowerment, voice, and choice. We can empower our pro bonos by providing legal education and resources so that they feel confident in their substantive advocacy. And also making sure that they know that they have a voice, right? They're not just sort of a dumping ground for cases and just like, great, you have the case, see you later. But that we want to hear their feedback. They do have a voice, and that is really, really important for us, and that we listen, right? And respond. It's not just if they have a suggestion or if they have a point of feedback or if they have a frustration that they're experiencing. It's not just falling on deaf ears, but that we actually take action in response to that. And then finally, cultural, historical, and gender issues. And this obviously can include cultural competency training, cultural humility training for pro bono attorneys to feel more comfortable working with clients from different backgrounds, but also thinking about our pro bono attorneys' backgrounds. And again, how that shows up in the work. Is this pro bono attorney an immigrant themselves? And if so, how is that going to change the way that they function throughout this case, the way that they identify with this case, the way that they relate to this client? This is outside of the pro bono context, but I think one of the most profound things that I heard from a colleague, because I am not an immigrant, I am a white woman. And so that is one of the big areas of departure that I have from ways that I can relate to my clients. And I won't ever understand that part of their experience and their story. And I recall a colleague of mine whose family, she just come from a family of immigrants. They talked about how it's really lovely to say, turn your work phone off and turn your work off at the end of the day. But she's like, I can't, I go home and I have people dealing with their own immigration applications, or maybe I have my own immigration application pending, or I have family members asking me questions because I know I'm in this work. And that was a really profound realization for me, because I think that's one of my go-tos for self-care, is like having that boundary and turning off. And so if we're working with a pro bono attorney who can't turn it off in that way, that's important for us to understand and then adapt our advice and our support that we're giving accordingly. And then the last framework from SAMHSA is the domains of implementation. So these are the 10 places that SAMHSA is saying, look at these areas, and this is how you're going to implement these changes. So just highlighting a couple that jump out to me from a pro bono program standpoint: financing, right? Grants, money. We write our grants for placement numbers and the trainings that we'll provide to pro bono attorneys, but maybe we want to change our approach and really carve out things in our proposal that speak to the time and resources and energy that are needed to provide appropriate supervision. It's not just the substantive supervision, but to be able to have regular meetings with pro bono attorneys, to be able to have funds available for trainings and speakers and all sorts of other resources, to have monies available for interpretation and perhaps having meeting space. All of these things should really be part of how we are putting together our proposals for the money and the support that we're receiving for these programs. Because obviously, we are all very strapped at the end of the day, and we all understand that. And there's never enough people to go around to do all the things that we need to get done in one day. And if we're not proactively making sure that our programs and our deliverables are set up in a way that accommodate for the time necessary to go through all of these things that we're talking about, it's not going to be feasible. Another thing is the screening and assessing, and I shared some of my thoughts on the prior slide when thinking about what does the placement package look like. Maybe we have trigger warnings. How do we communicate that information in a safe way? How do we make sure that we are making intentional matches between clients and pro bono attorneys, and not just thinking about the client's needs and, okay, this client has experienced XYZ thing, or they've been through ABC experiences, and so we think this pro bono attorney would be a good fit. Great example would be a domestic violence survivor. I have a pro bono attorney who is really, really experienced in that field. She's been doing the work for many years. And so I think it'd be natural to me, and I have done this, when I see a domestic violence case come through, I immediately think of her. And although that might be a good match, I think what screening and assessing from a trauma-informed lens for pro bono attorneys means is taking a pause and thinking, okay, how does she feel about that? Like, if she's taken 5 domestic violence cases in the past 2 years, is she burnt out on those? And let me talk to her about that. And let me share that experience and make sure she understands that this is a domestic violence case, and how do you feel about it? So I think that was something that I started thinking about, because I usually just get so excited when I feel like I have a good match, but I'm often thinking of it just through the lens of the client. And then evaluation, I think this is really important and goes hand in hand with the progress monitoring and Q&A. So one of the things that, as I was preparing for today, that I realized is I'd like to have more conversations with my pro bono attorneys that I work with about these things, because I haven't, maybe at the outset of the representation, because I always share that I'm really big on trauma-informed lawyering and everything. And I do try to check in as we're prepping for hearings and everything, but we've never had these really explicit discussions about, like, what has this work been like for you? And like, what have you struggled with? And like, what could I have done better? And so I shared this with Sachi and Laura when we were prepping for today. I was really grateful for this opportunity, because it turned out to just be this great chance for me to learn and reflect. And so I think having those ongoing methods of collecting feedback and thinking about the ways that we're doing that, I think it's one thing to have a one-on-one conversation, and that's great, but that could skew things. People may not feel comfortable, giving candid feedback. So thinking about the ways that we're obtaining feedback and at what point of the representation, because the feedback and the emotions might be different after a case is won versus when you're in the thick of it. And maybe it's actually a little bit more important to know that in the thick of it response versus once we've gotten over the hump and we have asylum. So I want to switch over to Menti for our first group poll. And so the question is going to be, how trauma informed is your program? So if you want to open up your phone, again, or another browser window, and go to menti.com, menti.com. And we're going to be using the code 32213041. And we're going to pop that in the chat. I'm going to toggle away from this slide, but we will still have that information up at the top of the screen. So specifically, we're going to be looking at how many of SAMHSA's principles, those 6 principles of trauma-informed care, does your pro bono program currently incorporate? And by the way, no shame in the game. If you respond 0, that is part of why I'm hoping to have a conversation. I will not disclose the number that I would rate my program because that would not be anonymous, but just know that I reflected on this myself as I was putting together this slide. So folks will see, I was gonna say, folks will see the numbers show up as responses come in. Ooh, 6. Love that. Really hope that we can engage that person in some conversation before we finish up today. So this is great. Okay, we got 1 0, and that's okay. But it seems like mostly people are in like that 3 to 4 range, which I think is excellent. That's really, really great. So the hope would be, I think coming out of today, maybe we can all commit, and we'll have this as an open-ended question at the end, but maybe we can all commit to one change, no matter how small, that we can make in our program that might move us a little closer to that next number on this screen. So 4 seems to be the sweet spot for sure. And again, maybe when we have the question, the Q&A at the end, if we have time for that, we can hear a little bit more about which of the principles are most common or most intuitive or easy to incorporate. All right, so then we're going to move on to our next question, which is, how does your program incorporate these principles? So this is going to be an open-ended response. So you can write as much or as little as you want. You should be able to submit multiple responses, and we should see those pop up on the screen as folks enter those in. So you're welcome to share which of those principles you identified as being part of your program. You're welcome to share how you incorporate it, whatever feels relevant to elaborate on, if you're comfortable. And if you are not seeing this question show up on your phone or on your window, there should be a little bar that shows up that we moved to the next slide. So if you click that, that'll advance you on to the next one. So collaborative work, representation, and interculturality. I love that. I like the collaborative work especially. And I know that that was one of the things I caught at the end of the last program, like thinking about what our relationship is to the representation, to the case, like us as the LSO, the legal service organization. And I think there's always that balance, at least I struggle with this, of how do I be a collaborative partner without overstepping my bounds as not the attorney of record. I know that's one I struggle with. That regular communication, absolutely. Checking in on a regular basis, being quick to respond to things, good peer-to-peer support and ability to ask questions. Check-ins on stress levels and to make sure we're not overworked. I love that. I think that was one of the things that I took away as I was prepping for this, because that check-in is a part, it's on my agenda with all the people I supervise in-house in our organization. It's the first thing on our weekly one-on-one agendas is check-in. How are you doing? And that's not supposed to be substantive at all. I don't want to hear about your cases, like what's going on in your life. And I realized that I don't really do that with pro bono attorneys. So I think it's like realizing that a lot of the principles that I apply to try to be a trauma-informed supervisor, manager, leader, whatever the case is, it's those exact practices that I can just bring into my mentorship of pro bono attorneys. Safety trainings, transparency with every intake, making sure people understand the roles. Again, that's super, super important, both for the client and the pro bono attorney. Again, that transparency and expectation setting, safe spaces, regular mentoring, reviewing filings. Again, that substantive aspect, which, although it's not the only part, is really important because people need to feel comfortable and confident in their substantive abilities to handle the case. Sharing opportunities to learn or engage with other volunteers. I love that one. And that is actually one of my big suggestions out of the feedback I got from pro bonos, because I think there's a lot of untapped potential for the ability to create a sense of community with other pro bono attorneys and not just with us as the staff of the legal service organization. So thank you so much to everybody who shared. I hope you are into Menti as much as I am. I find it really helpful in these, digital spaces as a way to connect with each other. And I know that's a little bit harder now that we're all on Zoom. So third part of our conversation is going to be thinking beyond the legal resources. So I mentioned in response to one of the things that somebody shared, like obviously providing mentoring and support on the law and how to do the case from a legal standpoint is important, but that's not it. That's not the only thing that we need to be thinking about. And again, I'm including myself in this we as very, very guilty of often getting stuck and bogged down in the like, okay, what PSG are we arguing? So just to share a little bit about what I did to get some of this feedback, I wanted to hear from pro bono attorneys. I didn't want this to just be like my ideas of what I think could work. So I did two things. One is I set up an anonymous survey, which I shared both with the attorneys that I work with at Catholic Charities, but I also shared that on LinkedIn with other organizations. So it was not limited just to the attorneys that do pro bono work with Catholic Charities, not just limited to direct representation. I have no clue who responded to it. It was truly anonymous. But I had a variety of questions asking about their experiences doing pro bono work and trauma, right? And whether they've experienced the effects of trauma, whether they had resources or knowledge about trauma work going into their pro bono service. And then the other thing that I did was do specific one-on-one meetings with a handful of folks who I've worked closely with over the past year. So these are pro bono attorneys. I tried to pick a variety of backgrounds. So we had people who were at big law firms, we had people who were solos, people who were retirees. I really wanted to get a variety of perspectives. And obviously this is all anecdotal. I am not a researcher, so this was no, formal methodology. But my hope was that it could allow me to make sure that I was sharing, voice, choice, and empowerment, that I was sharing the voices of pro bono attorneys and not just my perspective of what it's like to be one, because I've never been a pro bono attorney. And really just generate discussion and ideas and get our juices flowing and get us thinking and reflecting about what we could be doing differently in our programming. So starting first with the survey. So this was that anonymous survey that I sent out asking some specific questions about the context of their pro bono work. I would say there's 3 domains that the survey focused on. So thinking about their prior experience coming into this with trauma survivors, the resources that were available to them, and then their experience working with trauma survivors. So one of the first big takeaways is that the majority of pro bono attorneys who responded said that they've struggled with the effects of secondary exposure to trauma at some point in their pro bono work. Unsurprising, I think. Those secondary effects included all the forms of work-related stress that we discussed in the prior section. So folks didn't specify which of those. It was just sort of, have you ever experienced any one of these at any point? Second takeaway was only 40%, so less than half of the people who responded had ever received any kind of education, training, or other information about trauma or trauma-informed representation prior to taking their first immigration case. So that's kind of wild to think about. Like, they were jumping in, 60% of folks were jumping in without any basis of understanding even what trauma is or how it might show up, let alone how they as attorneys could incorporate trauma-informed practices. Coupled with a third finding that more than 3/4 of the people who responded had no prior experience with directly representing trauma survivors, that hits 3 of those 6 factors we talked about earlier that can increase susceptibility to developing work-related stress, right? So working in isolation, lack of experience, and then prolonged exposure. So then last, the majority of the attorneys who responded to the survey identified at least one additional resource, although most of them identified more than one. This was an open-ended question where they could just list, are there any other resources or things or tools that would be helpful for you to be more trauma-informed, but also to engage in meaningful care of your own mental health during these cases. There's Milo in the background. We almost made it. So everybody who responded yes listed at least one resource, but honestly, most of them listed more than one, which really wasn't surprising. So some of those included standing one-on-one meetings with their mentoring or supervising attorney, community building opportunities with other pro bonos, and more traditional trainings on trauma and trauma work. So I want to highlight one specific experience, and this came from those one-on-one direct calls or interviews that I had with folks. And this, I would just note, Morgan is a pseudonym, but Morgan did consent to their responses being shared anonymously as part of this training. So Morgan is a second-year associate at a large multinational firm based here in New York City. Prior to their pro bono work, Morgan had no direct representation experience. Their practice focused completely on white collar matters representing corporate clients. So I think a really common profile of a pro bono attorney that we might work with. Morgan began working on their first defensive asylum case in February 2020, so right before the pandemic. And during our conversation, Morgan talked a lot about the challenges of being fully remote and really lacking connection to colleagues while working on such an emotionally charged case. They shared that in the months and weeks leading up to the individual hearing, they really struggled with heightened stress, poor sleep, and constant thoughts about the case and what would happen if the client wasn't granted asylum. And one of the things that stayed with me most about our conversation is a point Morgan made about kind of the stakes in immigration cases versus the stakes in corporate litigation. They talked about how in a firm, so first of all, you're working as part of a big team, which lightens that burden and kind of the weight of responsibility on any one attorney. But second, you're representing a company and not an individual person. And while obviously Morgan is a very zealous advocate for their corporate clients, I understood what they were saying, because it's almost like, I can imagine there's this like emotional buffer of sorts when your client is an entity that feels more amorphous or abstract, in contrast to doing direct representation when you're sitting directly across from the person whose legal case is now in your hands. So Morgan shared that they really weren't prepared for that aspect of the work and that feeling of responsibility, and that really took a toll on them. And then another thing that really struck me was they shared that even after the individual hearing, which, by the way, went incredibly well, and honestly would have been granted on the spot, but for biometrics. I don't need to tell all of you about the lovely experience that is delayed defensive biometrics. So that's where we're at right now. But really positive hearing. The client felt good. Everybody felt good, except for the fact that we couldn't walk away with an order. But Morgan disclosed that despite that, it took almost 2 weeks for them to return to a normal sleeping rhythm where they weren't waking up in the middle of the night anymore thinking about the case. And that really stuck with me, because I know I'm guilty of sort of like mentally checking off the case once we've gotten through the individual hearing, like, okay, that one's done, on to the next one. And what Morgan shared made me realize how important it is that I continue checking in with pro bono attorneys and intentionally create those spaces to debrief even after the bulk of the representation has finished. So from this survey and these conversations, I think there were 3 overarching themes that kept showing up in the feedback I was getting from folks. So one is education and providing ongoing education in various formats tailored to different learning styles. This was something I heard again and again, that, it's not just a reading, you hand off like a bunch of PDFs for people to read at the start of the representation. Everybody was like, yeah, I didn't actually read those, which honestly, I probably wouldn't either. So thinking about the format of the information that we're providing to people in different learning styles, to just make sure that diverse preferences and abilities, people can access and absorb the information effectively. Then the second thing was fostering a sense of community and connectivity to prevent that working in isolation, because you want to be promoting collaboration and, having that connection with other people that's going to enhance mental well-being. And then the last one was offering mentorship that considers the emotional well-being of pro bono attorneys and not just, again, the substantive law of the case, because that's going to make sure that we're paying attention to where they are throughout the course of the representation, if they're showing signs of work-related stress, especially because we are probably going to be a little bit more familiar with those concepts than they might be. So we kind of need to show up for them and use our expertise to help flag for them and, with love and with care, guide them if they seem like they're struggling and provide them with support. So in conclusion, I think, how do we take all of this and do something with it? I love an action item. I love coming away with something that I can actually do, not just a concept. So obviously all of our programs are different, and every pro bono attorney is going to be different in terms of needs and resources. But I'd love to just initiate that conversation today and share some ideas of what this could look like to have a more trauma-informed pro bono program. So as far as those 3 themes that I mentioned, education. I think live trainings are one that I heard a lot of. So they don't want webinars, it's not handouts, but the ability to interact live in real time with somebody about the material that's being presented. And that also provides that connectivity. So it kind of leads into that second part of building community. Simulations, this was a really great idea that I got directly from a pro bono attorney. So I take no credit for this whatsoever. So before perhaps the first time that a pro bono attorney meets with a client, do a role play with them where you play the client and they can practice how they're going to approach that initial meeting and delving into details about the traumatic experience. I thought that that was brilliant, and that builds confidence for the pro bono attorney. And it also minimizes re-traumatization for the client because they can practice and make mistakes and have missteps in the course of your simulation, and there's no risk of harm. And then shadowing, I know that at least in my practice, I prioritize opportunities to shadow in court, but it was pointed out to me that the bulk of the interactions with the clients are not in court. So this obviously would be a little tricky because it would involve client confidentiality and getting consent from your clients for this to happen. So I realize this might not always be possible, but there is this idea of being able to shadow their pro bono supervisor, their pro bono mentor, and see how they handle a client case, just like the watch and learn. So then for that second concept of community, one of the attorneys that I spoke with brought up the idea of a mentoring program. So not for a mentor within the LSO, the legal services org, but within your community of pro bono attorneys. And I absolutely loved that idea. I think this is one of the ones I'm going to really, really try to bring to life over the next year. So finding perhaps, an attorney who's handled 4 CIJ cases already, a pro bono attorney, and linking them up with an attorney who's new to the program and is taking a CIJ case for the first time. So they have, in addition to their LSO supervising attorney, they have a designated person that they can reach out to and who gets it from their perspective as a pro bono attorney. Group meetings was another one that was brought up. So the concept of maybe standing monthly meetings for the pro bono attorneys. So maybe you'd have somebody from the LSO there to facilitate, but a space that they could congregate. And I loved that because I thought about how important it is for me to be able to, if I'm in the office, walk down the hall and just like throw some ideas around with a colleague or vent to them or just be like, oh my God, I just heard the most like terrible thing, whatever it is, or I want to strangle this DHS attorney. Or if we're remote, they just Slack, right? I do those same things over Slack, but having those outlets are so important. And so the idea of creating that space where there's no training, there's no formal agenda, it's just people showing up and just connecting and talking to each other. And then social events too, finding ways to connect and build relationships outside of the work. So, whether it's happy hours or other sorts of, activities that you can put together. Obviously, not everybody's going to participate in everything, but just some opportunity to be able to get to know one another outside of the context of doing the work. And then that last one, emotional support, the one that came up the most here was multidisciplinary support. So being able to talk to a social worker or somebody who is a clinician or has experience with mental health services to get feedback from them about how to approach things with a client. One of the ideas that I had as I was brainstorming with one of the attorneys was, if we have these monthly group meetings, I feel pretty confident that we could probably convince like a local professor or, local social work student, we could find somebody who would be willing to volunteer maybe like once a quarter to just come in for an hour virtually to that group meeting with the pro bonos and just provide like clinical supervision to them almost. I know that that's a thing that I would also love to have available as an organization. And I know that the big barrier there is cost. It's very expensive to have somebody on staff, but that's why I think we can tap into some other volunteer networks outside of the legal community to help with that. And then holistic case matching, I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, but really thinking through who this client is, what their experience has been, what the lift is going to be on this case, and also thinking about the pro bono attorney and their background and what their job looks like, and being really transparent about that. I think one of the things that I heard again and again was, I didn't realize how many hours and just how much work would go into it. And I know that I'm always scared to say that up front because I don't want to scare people away. I want to be able to make those placements and make those matches. And if I say it's going to be upwards of like 50, 60, 70 hours of work, if not more, I'm scared people will say no. But I think that that's important to move away from that fear, because the other result is that we don't disclose that. We're not as transparent about that as we could be. And that can end up really, really harming somebody if they take something on that is more than they can chew. And then the last one was supervision meetings, which again felt like kind of a no-brainer in hindsight. But with staff I supervise in-house, we have weekly one-on-ones. We should have something similar for pro bonos. And actually, from these conversations, I have now a monthly standing one-on-one with one of my pro bonos, because it was something that we talked about in the course of this, discussion. So these are a couple of my ideas. I know that we're at 4:35, so we may not have time for this. Sachi, you can give me the thumbs up or the thumbs down. But I was going to say, if we can switch to Mentimeter, would love to hear what ideas you might have from today's conversation. But I would also be happy to connect offline and share those as well, and would really love to do that anyway.